Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kira Phillips. Thanks so much for streaming with us as our special coverage continues here on ABC News Live. A live look now at the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv as Russian forces approach the city. Here's what we know right now. NATO activating its response force, the first time the alliance has ever activated the 40,000 troops for deterrence and defense. The push toward Kyiv reportedly going slower than the Russians had expected, especially in the past 24 hours. The Pentagon saying there's been greater resistance by Ukrainians, and it appears the Russians have lost momentum. A senior defense official telling us only about a third of the 150,000 troops amassed on the border are actually fighting, and as of now, Russia has not committed the majority of its forces inside Ukraine. Thousands of Russian Navy infantry landing near the coastal city of Mariupol now, which could see heavy fighting. And President Biden speaking with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy earlier today. Zelenskyy tweeting that they discussed strengthening sanctions, defense assistance, and an anti-war coalition. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson also announcing new sanctions against Putin and urging other NATO leaders to take further action to inflict maximum pain on the regime. All of this happening as Meta says Russia has restricted the use of Facebook after the company refused to stop fact-checking Russia media outlets. Joining us now with the very latest, ABC's Ian Pannell. He's in Ukraine's capital of Kyiv. Also, ABC's Phil Lipoff is in Poland. Thank you both for just continuing our coverage with us. Ian, let's start with you. Russian troops continuing their assault on the country, zeroing in on Kyiv. New satellite images actually showing Russia crossing from Belarus into Ukraine in an effort to fully take over the capital. What does it feel like to be there right now? Give us an update.
Yeah, Kira, I mean, I have to say the mood is bleaker, the situation more tense, the future looking more dark than at any point in this crisis so far. This really is a city bracing itself for the worst. We know that Russian forces were spotted inside Kyiv today. Defense forces have been activated in the city. We've seen troops running around. I've seen trucks loaded with ammunition driving around, people setting up defensive positions. The head of the armed forces essentially lifted almost all restrictions on anyone joining the army, including age restrictions. They've been handing out thousands of weapons to civilians for them also to defend their areas. We're hearing stories of people setting up defensive units in their neighborhoods. There is a real sense here that the worst is about to come. And given the tone of what we've been hearing from the Kremlin, there doesn't seem to be any appetite whatsoever to try and find a diplomatic way out of this. This is going to be a battle. It's going to be bloody. There are going to be a lot of casualties. And there are now tens of thousands of Ukrainians on the run.
And as you report that, and we hear these details from you, Ian, at the same time, it seems quite remarkable that the president of Ukraine actually posted a video just outside of his office there in Kyiv showing that leadership is still in the city and that they plan to fight. How has this impacted morale, and how unusual is it to put out a video like this?
Yeah, I mean, this is all about morale. This is all about stiffening resolve. President Zelenskyy clearly feels he has to lead from the front. Inevitably, there is going to be disinformation thrown around by the Russians about this. And, of course, the Ukrainians have to use propaganda to their advantage. But, yes, we identified that this was right outside his offices, together with the defense minister, the prime minister, the head of parliament, essentially saying, we are here. Now, Zelenskyy also today talking, saying, look, it's all very well you showing us support from abroad, but we're here on our own, you know, and no one's coming to Ukraine's aid in terms of the fighting, and they are feeling the pressure. They know they face a far superior military, and yes, it's possible that we're going to see tens of thousands of people pick up weapons ready to defend themselves, but they are facing overwhelming odds. It is going to be a bitter and bloody and brutal battle, and it's going to be a very hard 24, 48 hours ahead. There was a moment today when perhaps it looked like there could be some kind of diplomatic breakthrough, but it didn't look serious. It didn't look like the Russians were serious. and President Zelenskyy is not ready to surrender, which is essentially what the Russians are saying. Vladimir Putin, again, talking about sort of proto-Nazi units in the country without offering any evidence whatsoever. But this is his alternate universe. This is his justification for this war, that this is defending the security and the safety of Russia and the Russian-speaking people. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. This is an act of aggression. As President Biden said, it's a war of choice, and it's a war that has no meaning. There's no real purpose here other than to crush Ukraine, expand Russian influence, trying to restore some warped sense of Russian military and geographic pride. But we've seen opposition inside Russia. We've seen Russian figures, sporting figures, voice their opposition to what's going on here. You know, the peoples of Europe are speaking loudly against this. But the truth is, the people of Kyiv are alone tonight, and many of them are sleeping in basements, sleeping in metro stations, and they're afraid, and they're quite rightly afraid of what is about to happen.
As we see the video right there that you and your photographer have been able to capture for us inside Ukraine there. Meanwhile, Phil, the UN refugee agency now estimated some 100,000 Ukrainians have already been forced from their homes. How are neighboring countries preparing to take on these refugees, and specifically where you are as well?
Well, quite frankly, Kira, the borders are open and the countries are willing to do this, but it is going to be a monumental task. You hear Ian describe the dark time that has fallen upon the capital city, Kyiv, in Ukraine, across the border, and yet people will be sleeping in basements tonight, those who stayed. Ian points out that tens of thousands and now hundreds of thousands are working their way toward the borders. Here in Poland, one aid worker told us that the country of Poland has opened up 123 reception centers. These are places to receive Ukrainians who come into this country. They will not be areas where people can camp out. They will be areas where the Ukrainians can come and then sort of transition into life here. Poland already has about 2 million Ukrainians living here. So some of these people crossing the border will have family and friends, but some will be coming into a country they don't know. But the borders are open in the countries surrounding Ukraine, and the wait, Kira, is anywhere from 10 to 20 hours depending on the border.
So, Phil, you've been in contact, I understand, with our chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz, as she and her team just crossed into Slovakia, right? What have you heard on that?
We've been in contact with Martha and her producer, Sam, and I really feel like it's important to get this information out there because you can hear the words refugee crisis. We've heard them before. But what Martha and Sam just experienced is something that needs to be told to the world, and people really have to try to visualize it. Martha and Sam walked across the border, a rural border, into Slovakia. They chose that border because they thought it would be one of the easiest to cross. The wait to cross into Slovakia at that border is about 10 hours right now. They walked across it with women and children, Ukrainian women and children. The men 18 to 60 stood at the border. Think about this, Kira. They stood at the border and hugged and kissed their families goodbye and watched the women and children walk into unknown territory, uncertain territory in Slovakia. People were crying as they were hugging their families. They were so unprepared, Martha and Sam report, that they didn't have gloves on. This is bitter cold in this region. And these men 18 to 16, as Ian just pointed out, are being told they can't leave the country. They have to stay and fight. Most of these people aren't fighters. They're not in the military. And they just had to say goodbye to their wives and children as they watched them walk into Slovakia. That is the face of a refugee crisis that is only just beginning.
As we see those faces right now in the pictures that you capture for us, it's a story we will stay closely on, indeed, from Kyiv to Poland. Phil and Ian, thank you both. And Phil, I'll take it back to you. All
right, Kira, thank you. I want to bring in Tom Bossert. The NATO alliance says that there was a price to pay here. And Tom is a national security analyst and former White House Homeland Security advisor. Tom, thanks for being with us. It's always good to discuss this with you. What do you make of NATO activating its response force for the first time in history? What exactly does that deterrence and defense mean in this particular role?
I think it's an incredibly wise move. I'd have recommended it. In fact, I'm not surprised by it at all. What we're seeing now is Putin in a completely unpredictable use of force right on all of their borders. So at this stage, it's only almost obvious that NATO activate this force. There's so much room for miscalculation here. In a lot of ways, Putin has let the genie out of the bottle. We can have Russian jets incurring, flying into other airspace, NATO airspace, Turkish airspace, Polish airspace, drawing fire and leading this thing into directions that we can't control. His military will take actions even without his permission if that happens, and it could spiral. So NATO has an obligation here to kind of circle the wagons.
Yeah, and Tom, we heard today from the Czech Republic that the Czech Republic and Poland restricting airspace to Russian carriers. The Russians do not have superiority over Ukraine. Ukrainian air defenses are still working. How significant is that for this fight against the Russians?
It's significant for, I guess, two reasons. One, it's a bit surprising that they haven't yet carried that out. It's usually the first step or one of the early steps in the Russian playbook, or really, I think, in any military playbook, or at least that's what most of the generals have been saying. We've seen this play out in the past. There's this acronym in Russian military planning called SOD-SIT, where they go after strategically damaging all of the enemy's critical infrastructure targets. It's pretty standard in their military planning playbook, so I suspect if they really want to, they will do it. I think it reveals, though, at least to me, that Putin does not have a clear military objective. At least it's not clear to any of the observers that I talk to. We don't know what he wants to achieve or whether he has the force adequate to achieve it and sustain it. If he really wants to take on maintaining control over Ukraine, given what we've seen in the defiant eyes of the Ukrainian people, he better have more forces ready to stay there longer. And I think he's got to decide whether he wants that objective. If he does make that decision, they'll take out air defense systems pretty quickly.
Tom, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said that NATO members would need to discuss whether a cyber attack against a NATO ally would then trigger that Article 5 response from the alliance. Talk about that for a second. What might that response look like?
Yeah, this has been brewing for a very long time. In fact, one of the NATO members, Estonia, many people will remember, they were attacked, a cyber attack that devastated their economy and their government systems by Russia, and they're a NATO member, and they asked NATO to consider that an act of war that would trigger the collective defense obligation under Article 5. And in fact, NATO chose not to take that action as a justification to attack further Russia. That's been a pending debate ever since. I think context here matters. So if that cyber attack causes physical harm, loss of life, and if it's done with the backdrop of this threatening buildup of military forces, I think NATO will view it differently. But there'll not be anybody arguing lightly to take any small pinprick cyber attack as a justification to get into war with Russia. It'll have to be something significant, but it certainly qualifies. And I'm glad that she said they're discussing it, because whether it's a cyber attack or a missile, if it kills people and destroys your territory or your possessions, that's grounds for defending yourself, and it's grounds for a collective defense.
President Biden spoke with Ukrainian President Zelenskyy again today, and after that conversation, Zelenskyy tweeted that they discussed strengthening sanctions, concrete defense, assistance, and an anti-war coalition. What does he mean by that, and what role could U.S. forces play in that kind of coalition?
Well, I can see a lot of U.S. force deployment to take up the backfill roles of other European forces if the Europeans start to send direct military aid into Ukraine. I think the president's been pretty clear, and at this point, even if he changed his mind, I don't know if he's got the domestic support for sending American forces directly into Ukraine. I think that what he discussed, though, on these sanctions being strong enough or weak enough is a really unfortunate sign of the stress that the Ukrainian people are under. I don't think any additional sanctions will have the immediate effect that President Zelenskyy is seeking, although I don't blame him for asking. We should pretty much try anything at this stage. I think instead most of these sanctions are designed to punish Russia and to attack their operating budget so that they can't sustain this for a long period of time. That's not very satisfying to people who are in harm's way watching their neighbors being killed. But it's not a direct defensive tool, and I think Zelenskyy is trying to apply it in that way.
And Tom, you're talking about the stress that Ukrainians are under. The UN says hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are on the move through the country, whether it's from the Donbas region all the way over to where I am in Poland because of this Russian invasion. They're talking about tens of thousands of them have already crossed into other countries. How is this, what is obviously going to turn into some sort of refugee crisis? How is that going to affect Europe and the U.S.?
It's going to strain everyone's ability to take care of their fellow man. We're going to see European countries having to accept a large diaspora of fleeing Ukrainians. All of us want to. American and European hearts are often larger than our bread baskets. So I'm not afraid of the willingness of the European host countries or American host countries, but there will be an adjustment period there where you handle large inflows of people. You have to find housing and food sources adequate to take care of their needs. And remember, this is all happening in winter for a reason. I think you're seeing a lot of European hesitancy to turn on certain sanctions and address the SWIFT issue because, like it or not, they are dependent on Russian heating, oil, and gas. And so you don't want to freeze people to death. You want to make sure that there's a flow of energy source, and you want to make sure that these refugees have a place where they can find shelter and protection from the shelling. So I think that we'll see a generous community, a generous global response, and some pretty significant suffering in the interim.
Yeah, and we're seeing that happening here now in Poland as Poland welcomes those refugees, even in lines that are miles long. Tom Bossert, always good to talk to you. Thanks for the expertise.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.